You know what, Kate, what we can do as a workaround is I can just look at my own deck and then I can see what's behind you. So we'll just go with that. Good. So here we are. This is basically the situation that we find ourselves in today, which is that companies, whether they have upstream, midstream, or downstream oil and gas infrastructure, they have a legal obligation to retire that infrastructure, to decommission it, and remediate any contamination that is there. That is part of the regulatory compact, so to speak, with respect to this infrastructure. And although the industry faces retirement, not just because field decline, these assets get older, but also because of technology and policy that are aimed at curbing global warming, which is going to mean less demand for their products, and is going to mean these projects become economic as a consequence, have to be retired. And the real question is, even though companies have the obligation to retire, who's actually going to pay for that? So let's go through this. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of an overview, these are the things I want to cover first. What are asset retirement obligations? Who's responsible for them? How big is the problem and what it might cost to deal with it? And how are these costs covered today? So we're going to get a little bit into some of the security and other things related to that. Let's go to the next slide. So what is an ARO? An ARO is a legal obligation, and that's to decommission the infrastructure at the end of its life, remove the infrastructure, reclaim environmental damage. It's imposed by regulators by law, but also imposed sometimes, not always, by contract. For example, if you have an upstream, someone who's drilled a well on someone's private property, there may be some additional obligations that accompany that drilling. It's a liability. And we're going to get a little bit into how this works in terms of company balance sheets, but it's recorded on the company balance sheets on a discounted basis. I'm going to come back to that later, but discounting essentially means if it's going to be incurred 50 years from now, what is the present value of that obligation 50 years from now? It's obviously going to be a lot less, but that could be significant in terms of how investors understand this. Financial assurance is typically required, but the current amounts are too low. So financial assurance is essentially someone else, like an insurer or a surety bond provider, saying we will step in and pay some amount if the operator doesn't cover those costs. Unfortunately, the very low is we'll see just a fraction of what the actual costs are today, and that's one of the problems we have. And typically, as a practical matter, this liability is paid for from future cash flows. So you can imagine you drill some new wells, you make some money off those wells, you use that to plug and retire old wells to the extent you're actually doing that. The problem is if we're sunsetting this industry, which the energy transition suggests we will, where those future cash flows aren't going to be the money that we can use to retire these assets. So what else do we need to do? And then the last is it's a risk to taxpayers because of that. So when these obligations are unmet, the wells can become orphaned and abandoned. That means they're just sitting there. Nobody's paying for it. The state's going to have to do it, and that means taxpayers are going to have to do it. And in the interim, we might have all kinds of issues. Some of these wells leak substantial amounts of methane. For example, there can be other forms of pollution and contamination that occur from a well that has, particularly from a well that's been orphaned, but it can also be from existing producing wells. And so really, how do we grapple with these issues and ensure timely payment? That's one of the big considerations that's driven a lot of our work in this area. You go to the next slide. So how many wells are there in the U.S.? Nobody knows for sure because we have, a long time where we had drilling in the United States and records weren't kept. But approximately, some estimates, and there are others, this is not, I would say, solid fact here, about 2.6 million wells onshore and up to another 1.2 million undocumented wells. There are some other numbers that vary. And I should say, I'm going to talk a lot about wells today, but these asset retirement obligations, AROs, include all kinds of infrastructure, the gathering and pipelines, processing equipment, midstream, like pipelines for transmission, all the way to refineries, liquid natural gas facilities, so on and so forth. So it's all of these things. We're just going to focus a lot on wells. And you can see here on the right-hand side some estimates that we did in terms of what the magnitude of the problem is. And so you can see the number of wells in the first column, and the second is a ballpark estimate we've heard from industry before. Oh, it's only going to cost 30,000, per well to plug. We think it's going to be much higher. It's going to be a six-figure number, and you can see the end result is that in a survey we did a couple years ago, we were looking at $280 billion in onshore liability only. That doesn't include any of the infrastructure that Megan's going to be talking about offshore in a little bit, nor does it include pipelines, refineries, and other things. These are just wells. So this is a significant number, and something that is going to be is one of the drivers for being concerned about this. Let's go to the next slide. So here I'm just giving you a little more information on the cost. So if you looked across as an average across our cost model, it's about $119,000 a well just for the plugging activity. That doesn't include having to take all the topside, all the infrastructure away, or remediate, including soil replacement and other things that you might have to do if there was a leak. But when we look at actual data, get the receipts from different regulators, we see the costs sometimes are much higher. North Dakota estimates $167,000 a well in its submission to the federal government for funding. And when we looked at a bunch of wells that North Dakota confiscated during the pandemic, I think it was pursuing the CARES Act money, and they used that money to plug wells that operators would have otherwise had to plug. They were averaging about $279,000 a well. So these would be, make that $280 billion if you applied that $279,000 number per well, more than double what we had on there. So it's pretty substantial. So that would mean that you could even be getting up into $675 billion. And again, of course, this excludes all the other infrastructure. Let's go on to the next slide. So how are these paid for? Well, there is right now, as I said, a requirement to have financial assurance. That's basically a pledge of value to ensure payment of a liability. That's what financial assurance is generally. In most jurisdictions today, this takes the form of a surety bond. That's essentially an insurer promising to pay up to a fixed amount, to the state if the operator doesn't plug the well. So what they get paid, the surety bond providers get paid a percentage of the face value of that bond, sometimes pretty low, 1% to 2%, can be higher though, because it's based on the individual operator. And then they also get some money, let's say in a restricted cash account or something from the operator to make sure that they pay, for plugging. But in most jurisdictions, people are allowed to get what's known as a blanket bond. So the blanket bond might cover 100 wells, 1,000 wells. Sometimes they're scaled, so you can only cover a certain amount of wells with the blanket bond, but sometimes it can cover however many wells you have in a state or nationwide as the federal regime allows. And the result of that is it's not scaled proportionally to the risk, right? If you have 10 delinquent wells, you're much less of a risk than if you have 1,000 delinquent wells. But oftentimes the blanket bond basically allows those people to be similarly bonded up. And this is one of the main drivers that the bond estimates are really quite low. Let's go to the next slide. So how low are the bond estimates? We think it's about 1% of the plugging cost based on our estimates. And if the costs are higher, then it's even lower. Here's a collection of states, and you can see what the estimates are in terms of costs, right? So New Mexico, for example, we would estimate over $10 billion in costs, but the total bonds, $170 million. So basically, something approximating 2% of what they really need. These are too low, and this causes all kinds of problems. But I mean, one of them is that you can, if you are an operator and you have to plug this well, you might be more inclined to pass it off to somebody who has no intention of plugging it and would rather just forfeit their bonds at the end, give up the ghost, so to speak, of the company, and let those pass on to governments, because at most you're going to lose that fraction, which is the surety bond that you had, not have to pay the whole cost and have all the uncertainty of having to plug the wells. So we have a system that by making the bonds too low, we incentivize people to not plug these wells. And you could think of an example. I mean, during the housing crisis in 2008, lots of people, rather than pay the prices of home values dropped substantially. They just made a choice. It's better for me rather than continuing to pay on this just to leave it because the cost of my mortgage is higher than the value of this property. So that's the situation that structurally we're in the context of well plugging. Let's go to the next one. From an incentive standpoint, what you really want to do ideally is have some kind of financial assurance, whether it's a surety bond, and there are other mechanisms. You could have a sinking fund, some kind of cash account, or other things, as they do in the nuclear context, equal to the expected cost of plugging and reclamation. Right, so whatever it's going to cost, that's the kind of assurance you need to get. That's exactly what your mortgage lender would do. They wouldn't say, "I'm going to lend you $500,000 for a house that's worth $100,000." But that's effectively what governments are really doing. Is they're saying, "Okay, this is a liability you owe us, but we're only going to ask for a fraction of coverage of that liability." And doing so assures the risk covered. It gives the operators optimal incentives. And if you require that on some basis, you can also get the private sector to really help out by pricing the risk. If you make insurers liable for the full cost of this, they will do a lot of work to make sure they understand what those costs are and can price that adequately. Let's go to the next slide. So thinking about this issue across a range of states, the reality is that some states are worse than others. Some are better off. And so here, just introducing one way of thinking about this, which is what we call the producer ratio. So that's the highlighted column. And that's really looking at all the wells in a state after 1970. We're excluding some of the things that existed prior to a lot of oil and gas regulation to focus on this issue now. But what percentage of a state's wells are producing more than stripper well quantities, which is more than 15 barrels of oil equivalent a day? That means they have less wells that are low producing or non-producing that are sitting within their remit. And you can see there's a wide range. Interestingly enough, there's some, what we would call in political terms, red states near the top of this. I think that's an interesting issue that they, have done in some ways a better job of ensuring that there's coverage. But you have other states, really far down. You can see California down there at 5%, with lots of old legacy wells that really are producing nothing. So they're not generating the kind of cash from the sale of oil and gas that they're going to need to plug those wells and have some pretty significant issues. Let's keep going. Let's go to the next slide. Really solving this problem is really one of incentives, at least from a policymaking standpoint. We've got high plugging costs. Industry's talked those down for a long time, but they're likely much higher than the industry has said. The bond amounts are too low, and that creates that disincentive to ever plug it, because you don't have the ability to plug the well and get rid of the bonding requirement and use that money for something else. The lack of plugging, with that lack of incentive to plug means there's no plugging, and all of this is going to be made worse by an energy transition as we increasingly wean ourselves off of oil and gas. But now is the time to fix the issue, particularly with the windfall profits you've all seen that companies have made. It's really time to start thinking about how can we use some of that money to make sure that these liabilities aren't socialized to taxpayers. So let's go on to a deeper level of this and think about the energy transition in the next slide on aero acceleration. We can go to the next slide, actually. So again, the incentives issue. If they're not required to set aside money, there's really not a lot of incentive to plug these wells. And as a consequence, we don't see a lot of plugging. In fact, what companies have typically done is when a well becomes mature, an exploration and production company will sell it on to another operator, who sells it on to another operator, down to the point that we will see wells held by companies that have almost no physical presence, P.O. Box type company, right, houses a bunch of non-producing or low-producing wells. And the result of that is, it's clear that those companies aren't going to be able to pay. Those are just orphans in waiting. And what we need to do is really kind of deal with that issue. But let's talk about how we get there. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of upstream oil and gas, we have really a negative feedback loop in terms of a confluence of factors that will continue to drive more orphaning of wells, particularly if there isn't some kind of policy response to address it. So you have natural field decline. That's just a function of oil production overall. Fields decline rapidly. This is especially the case for the newer fracked wells, where you have massive production at the beginning and then a sharp tail downwards with a trickle of production going on. If you have lower demand in the future over the long term, that's expected by pretty much everybody to lead to lower prices and therefore lower revenues for the companies. And again, these are paid from cash flows, and so that's a particular problem. You will have increased regulations. It could be in the form of carbon taxes and other things that address climate, or it could be in the form of increased bonding regulations as states and the federal government wake up to the problem that is on their hand. That's going to increase the costs of maintaining these wells into the future, and may also have the effect of accelerating some companies exiting, and not exiting by plugging the wells, exiting by bankruptcy. So as regulators increase financial assurance requirement, capital markets will also see this. And what I mean by that is investors. When they see increased risk, they will demand what's known as a risk premium for that. That means that they're going to be expecting a higher rate of return from the company to compensate them for the potential for default. That reduces the company's profits. If they have joint or several liabilities exists in some jurisdictions, I know Megan may get into this a little bit more, then that means that some liabilities that they thought they passed on to another operator might come back to haunt them. So for example, in California, back to 1996, you can pursue prior owners if the current owner of the well doesn't pay. And the confluence of all of these things is just going to lead to accelerated retirement. And part of the reason that this is an issue, and we can go to the next slide, is that investors don't even think about this that much today. So what I've provided here is a chart that shows, an asset retirement obligation that's due 40 years from now. So a well just got drilled. They think they're going to plug it in 40 years. This will cost $50 million. These are all illustrative numbers. It won't, typically would not cost $50 million to plug a well, but think of this as like a facility or something like that. And just throwing in some numbers on inflation, credit adjusted risk for the company, those things, they discount that $50 million that they'd have to pay 40 years from now and put it in their financial statements at the present value. Okay, so the present value of that 50 million liability today would be about $5 million. So it looks like a $5 million liability. As you go over time and approach that 40-year mark, that number would rise along the curve of that red line that you see there. But really what will happen if we have accelerated retirement along with the cycle slide I showed you before is that due date for plugging that well is going to come up a lot earlier. Okay, and so these numbers have the possibility of creeping up on investors in a way that they say, okay, we're not going to actually plug in 40 years, we're going to plug in 20 years. Well, if that happens, all of a sudden you're going to have a big jump. And so for the financial markets, this is something that when we've talked to investors about this, theoretically they could be aware of this, but practically they're not, and they don't think about it. Analysts don't think about it. If you look at credit ratings agencies, some like S&P include this in their calculations of debt for companies, but others like Moody's don't in terms of the credit rating. Just don't consider it at all. So it is something that is, has the potential to catch markets unaware on top of regulators. So let's go to the next slide, just to give you an example of this. So here's BP. They have, most companies only put the discounted present value of those liabilities. BP actually adds the undiscounted provisions and says, okay, it's about 23 billion. So if we had to retire all of our infrastructure today, it'd be $23 billion. At the time we did this, that was a quarter of the market cap. It's about 19% now because the stock price is up so much because of high oil prices, but that's a significant chunk of the market cap of the company. And so these are big, and frankly, BP isn't even probably the best case example. There's lots of other entities that have, much less productive well inventories that would be more exposed than what BP has here. Let's go to the next slide. So what are the regulatory responses to deal with this? Increase financial assurance, impose a joint and several liability that makes companies liable for these assets even after they've sold them on, at least secondarily. Require parent guarantees. I won't go into all the detail about that, but you can understand that generally a subsidiary won't. I mean, a parent won't be liable for its subsidiary, barring piercing the veil or some other theory. And as a consequence, companies can house these in subsidiaries that they don't necessarily intend to ever, don't intend to plug the wells. And then lastly, to deal with the problem that we have many orphan wells already, and wells that are likely to be orphan, there's almost nothing that can be done at this point, industry decommissioning levies. So this is requiring industry as a whole that's still around to pay for costs that other operators have passed on. We've seen this in practice in places like Australia, where there was a large offshore decommissioning issue, and they imposed a levy of, I think, something like $500 million on the remaining players. And then tightening plugging requirements. So really forcing plugging to happen in a timely way rather than to let it sit around. I'm almost done here, but I want to talk about one other concept. Let's go to the next slide. And that is the economic life of a well and some of the economics of this, because it ends up being highly relevant and I think also encapsulates the problem that we have. And this is through holdback analysis. So what is holdback? Holdback is basically a lens for looking at, when you should be saying, okay, wait a minute, you're taking profits from this well, but you don't have enough money to pay to plug this well. And it really raises the question, should those be taken as profits, or should those be allocated to the plugging obligation on the well? So you could think as an illustrative graph, this is sort of that curve that goes down is a production from a well. I mean, this is all stylized, right? But then there's a first part where there's, the cash flow that's coming from the well just pays off what it costs to actually drill the well and operate it. And then there's something we call the distributable life in the middle. That is the money that is positive cash flow from the well that could be used by, to pay off debt, to pay off equity holders, whatever it is. Okay, so that's money that the company has earned from the production. And then we get to the holdback period, and the holdback period really is the point at which, based on what we see will be future production from this well, is the amount of future of cash flow, from net cash flow from the future production, that is equivalent to what it's going to cost to plug that well. Okay, so whatever we think it is, that's what when you enter holdback, and really that's where the question is. Okay, there should either be some kind of full financial assurance, or that money needs to be going to preparing for plugging instead. We can go to the next slide. So kind of that same idea, but just looking at this graphic is. The blue is sort of positive cash flow, but at some point we get to that point of holdback where, going forward, you're producing less and less and less, and so the difference between what you're going to make in money going forward and what your plugging cost is at the end grows bigger and bigger. Okay, let's look at the next slide, because this really encapsulates the issue. This is a particular company, KP Kaufman, that we studied in Colorado. And these two graphs represent the same data expressed in a different point of view. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you have the operator KP Kaufman, and you have what its cash flows from the wells were. Okay, mostly positive, you can see, even once you get into that red color. Okay, and then on the right-hand side is same information, but just looking at at actually incorporating the asset retirement obligation. And so the point is, when you get into the red color on either graph, that's when all of the revenues that were being generated, okay, were probably likely insufficient to cover the plugging for the several thousand wells that are encapsulated in the data in this graph. So what that means is this company is just going along, continuing to produce what it looks at as positive cash flow, but it's got this huge liability at the end that is just not covered at all. And what we're seeing is that money is then being distributed, right, to the people who own the company. It's not being put aside to deal with these wells. This is a huge problem, and KP Kaufman is really on the precipice of orphaning, and has said this to the state, might potentially orphan thousands of wells in Colorado. And so, which would be a massive, massive cost to the state. So this just shows the problem here. And I want to point out one other thing. You can see that star on either chart. Many of these assets that have gotten into the red, so to speak, that we're not going to be able to pay for their own plug-in from future cash flows, they were sold to KP Kaufman long after that. Okay, they were, that's in 2018 or so. The assets we're focused on here were sold to KP Kaufman. That means they were really kind of negative value when they were transferred. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means in a legal context later, but from a financial and economic standpoint, that's kind of what we're seeing here. So just a couple more slides and I'm almost done here. If we go to the next one. So what are the expected sort of outcomes and consequences of this? We think that, barring addressing this problem, we're going to see bankruptcies increasing, particularly with cyclical downturns. We'll see an increasing of orphan wells as a consequence, and a shifting of, socializing costs whilst having already privatized the benefits of well ownership become more extreme. We'll see companies continue to evade arrows through sell-offs, transfers, spin-offs of marginal assets. There are many ways to do this we won't go into today. And then there's always a question of who pays. And we've seen a variety of different approaches. Australia has a decommissioning levy, like I mentioned. Alaska has required parent guarantees and other things on transfers that are good ways to do it. But we've also seen situations like in Colorado, where we had, the KP Kaufman example, where we're looking at having not done enough. Those are maybe going to come back to the state. And then Fieldwood, where, I think Megan will get a little bit more into this, where we had a massive bankruptcy in the offshore that basically put billions of dollars of liability because of joint and several liability back on the plates of other operators who had sold those wells. So recap here, just very quickly in the last slide. One more down. Oh, I missed a slide myself. Well, that's all right. That's all right. I'm short for time, so we should go here. So just to recap. So basically, in a nutshell, stranded assets mean less money for asset retirement obligations. That's the energy transition and the natural field decline causing that. If arrows accelerate, that means there's actually going to be earlier retirements. There'll be less money. It'll just be a self-reinforcing problem. In terms of scale, we probably have trillions of dollars globally. We have, 280 to 675 billion in onshore wells alone. So we think it's a very significant global issue, and there are both balance sheet and cash flow implications for it. In terms of risk, without playing today, the industry is going to continue to shift from positive to negative net value of these wells without any money being set aside. So that has to happen sooner rather than later. You have to get the money when it's there. And then things like holdback analysis can help you really pinpoint some of that point at which you really need to retire these wells. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I have to follow Rob. It's not fair. Whenever y'all are ready. Are we ready? I can't hear you, but I assume we're ready. Okay, guys, I'll try not to go too fast, and I'll apologize if I cough at all during this. I have a cough that won't go away. AROs, we're back at them, asset retirement obligations, but this is on the Outer Continental Shelf, the OCS. Next slide, please. And so a brief agenda, we're going to do a little history of the Outer Continental Shelf leasing program, an overview of the leasing program, how it functions, a bit on the decommissioning obligations and the regulations, idle iron and orphaned wells, decommissioned in place pipelines, and policy proposals. Next slide, please. And so, yes, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Oil and gas leasing and activity has been happening in open waters for a while, since probably the 1930s on, and it began in Louisiana's marshes. Louisiana is very watery, and it was a natural extension to go from the marshes, the swamps, out into open water. And there was, if you want to read up on a good legal case, it's the the Tidelands controversy, a battle between Louisiana and the federal government about who owned water, owned the water off the states. And it was agreed that it's different for each state. For Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, it's 3 nautical miles is state waters, and everything past that is federal waters. And then Texas, I think it's 7. California, it's 7. It depends on the state. So the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is what establishes a federal leasing program. And you see kind of an acceleration of that in 1972 during the oil embargo crisis, where the United States committed to a new all of the above energy strategy. This is when the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created, and it is also an acceleration of oil and gas leasing. Most of what you see today in terms of leasing on federal lands, be that Bureau of Land Management or federal waters, is a relic of that 1970s policy. And so when I worked for the agency, and still to this day, it is mandated that there is a 5-year program, and in that 5-year program, there should be at least 2 lease sales a year for the Gulf of Mexico. And that works out to usually 1 in March. There's supposed to be an oil and gas lease sale for the Gulf of Mexico in March, and then 1 in October. And so, yeah, like it says, it's an explicit federal policy of expansion. And the implicit goal of that is to secure energy security for Americans. But we can kind of pontificate on whether that is actually the case anymore. Next slide, please. And so, yes, the reports of NEPA's death are greatly exaggerated. People keep on talking about how NEPA really undermines federal action, and you can't do big energy projects. But having worked explicitly on NEPA for the federal government, I can say if you staff it, it functions quite well. We executed 2 lease sales a year and had for decades. And we also had, so it's a tiered process where you will have 1 5-year NEPA document, and then you'll have each lease sale document, and then that'll tier into the individual, exploration permits, the G&G, that's the seismic, these big boats that go out and shoot, big sound into the Gulf to get geological and geophysical information. All of these things are NEPA. And as you can see from that timeline, there are tight timelines for each thing. For a drilling permit, the office will have 30 days to process. Of course, onshore, that's different. The state of Texas, they have, I think, a 3-day application to permit to drill timeline, but you can expedite it for an additional fee. I think for like $100, you can have it within like a day. But NEPA is happening, but it's more of a rubber stamp, I would argue. Next slide, please. And so, yes, decommissioning obligations. So oftentimes when you hear about onshore leasing, it's kind of a game of hot potato. Whoever last touched it owns it, but that's not the case offshore. It's more like a plague. If you touched it, it will forever mark you. It will forever stain you. If you so as much like smell a lease on the Outer Continental Shelf, it will be your obligation. You have anything connected to it, you will be that it's joint and several liability. And so I tried to summarize it. This is just what you agree to. So the actual lease document, that is the contract between a lessee and the federal government. It very explicitly says you will return the seafloor to its original condition. And an interesting little tidbit about that is that Bessie, the sister agency of BOEM, maintains that even after, so if you plug the well, you remove everything, but that plug fails. If someone's overhead and sees that there's methane bubbles and that well needs to be re-entered and replugged, they can order you to do that forever, which implies that it is a short-term asset and a forever liability. Next slide, please. Yeah, joint and several liability. So again, you touch it, it's on you. And that includes, people, pipeline operators, people who will use pipelines to transport their product from their platform. Not everyone It's not like, oh, Exxon owns this pipeline. It's like, no, this block gets to all have a row on this pipeline. If you have an operating right or record title interest, if you touch it, you have joint and several liability. And that does not mean we go to each predecessor lessee based on order who touched it. It's everyone all at once. Next slide, please. Okay, so if these are so good, if our rules are so good, why is there something like Fieldwood, which Rob alluded to earlier? Why are there orphaned properties in the Gulf of Mexico? Well, it goes back to financial assurance. And there's a two-stage approach. First is a base bond, which should cover, just basic things. Like if you it's not OPA liability, that's an oil pollution act. But this is just a very small amount, base bond. And the supplemental bond is to cover additional obligations. And the problem is that they were determining whether an operator qualified or had to take additional bonding based on financial strength. So Shell, Exxon, BP, your big companies, they would be waived the supplemental requirements. But a lot of times in the Gulf of Mexico, they have joint agreements, they have joint lessees. And so BP will have a partnership with a less strong company, like mom and pop operator. And for whatever reason, that waiver of liability would somehow pass on to that other company, like an STD, it would stay with them. And this happened over decades to the point where we had companies that had no right to be waived that supplemental bonding, having no financial assurance to cover their decommissioning. Next slide. Oh, well, I didn't go into the actual big failures, but so that leads to an accumulation of companies that do not have appropriate coverage. And I'll give an anecdote to that. When I first came to this issue, I was in the Office of Leasing and Finance, and it was the bankruptcy of ATP or the bankruptcy of Benu. This was before Fieldwood, and it was a company similar to that where all of a sudden they were a sole liability operator, meaning that no one else was on the lease. They didn't have Shell, it was just them. But for whatever reason, their bonding had been waived and they did not have enough financial assurance, but they went under during, like the 2015 price crash. And that meant all of a sudden the agency was responsible for all these orphaned properties. And so I was charged with figuring out what are some in-house solutions that we can deal with this. Unfortunately, the one thing that we could do was just clarify that if you acquired that lease, because it was now there was blocks and there's leases. And if you acquired anything on that block, then you would suddenly have a hot potatoes instance where it was now your responsibility and obligation to take over those obligations. But how do you get people to acquire a liability? There was really nothing the agency could do outside of statutory change. It was something for Congress to deal with. So what's happening now? Well, there was interim rules that were brought in 2017, additional reporting requirements for decommissioning expenditures. So now BSEE requires that when a company decommissions, plugs and abandons, and removes all of its infrastructure, that they disclose all of the cost. And so BSEE now collects all of that cost data and gives it to BOEM, and BOEM will now use those costs to inform bonding amounts. A new office was created, the Office of Risk, and right before the Obama administration ended, they issued new financial assurance rules, which tightened everything. Of course, it was literally the last week of his presidency when those rules came out, and so they were repealed immediately. And the Office of Risk was kind of neutered, where it's become the de facto policy where they create tailored financial plans for each company. As you can imagine, there's a lot of companies operating on the OCS, and there's only so many people within the Department of the Interior who have this expertise, who are supposed to be monitoring these companies for solvency and for financial health. And so it was extremely burdensome to try to create tailored financial plans. And even in any attempt to try to put the hammer down and tighten restrictions a little bit, these companies would just call Steve Scalise, say, hey, your boys in New Orleans are tightening the vice too much, you need to put them in order. And that's pretty much what would happen. And yes, there's a financial assurance rule that's being, I think they already had some comments on one before, but now they're workshopping again. It has yet to be released. It's my understanding that the Biden administration is a little in releasing some of these things. And so that's where we're at. I know that there are some strong ideas in this new rule. It just has not been released. Next slide. I'm gonna drink some water because I sound like one of those NPR people. Okay. So just to give y'all a sense of the scale of the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not focusing on Alaska. I'm sorry, I'm not focusing on California. My area is the Gulf, so that's where I'm gonna focus. I mean, y'all can read, but it's a shit ton of stuff. 120,000 well bores, 50,000 wells. You know, let's see, 60% of more than 1,800 active production platforms are more than 25 years old. And, you know, one thing that I'll give you another little story. I briefly worked in the Office of Plans. And so these are the people that process your drilling permits. And I learned an application to decommission your pipeline. And it's interesting. So for all you lawyers out there, the NEPA document, which is like a 2,000-page document to support these lease sales, had a pretty unequivocal view of equilibrium, right? Like as new stuff is coming online, other stuff is being decommissioned, right? There's an equilibrium. And so there was an assumption from the biologists to, you know, the marine archaeologists that as you're putting new stuff in, stuff is being taken out. Little did I know that the agency, our sister agency, was allowing, but we were at one point the same agency, companies to leave pipelines on the seafloor, accumulating to 18,000 miles of pipelines that are not transporting commercial product. They're just sitting there on the seafloor. And the thing about the seafloor is that, you know, sand moves, like the hurricanes come through. So this stuff is like, you know, I've heard from commercial divers who are down there, and it just looks like a snake's nest of just like, you know, pipelines pushed up, and there've been, you know, spotted leaks during recent hurricanes. So we know that they're posing an obstruction, they're posing a risk. And they are especially an obstruction for activities like coastal restoration, where you need big dredge boats, which are like these big sand boats. To go get sand for coastal restoration, these pipelines are in the way. They have reduced the scale and size of what states can use to rebuild their coast and nourish their beach for storm protection. And they are also in the way for commercial wind, which we'll get into a little bit in the future. And then there's the structural idle iron list. And so there is an obligation to plug and abandon or remove all your infrastructure within a year of, excuse me, ceasing production. Once you're no longer producing in commercial quantities, you have to plug and abandon within a year. And if you are past that, you are put on the idle iron list and you are put on notice. And a colleague, the last time she was able to get information on it was 600 platforms in 2010, but we know there's more. And then of course there's reefed structures, which is the biggest scam. And I don't care, like if a biologist says they're a good idea, just check who's paying their bills. It's just letting companies to sink their structures instead of removing them, because it creates habitat. So we have 515 reef structures in the Gulf of Mexico. And the problem with all of this stuff is that they all require perimeters for commercial wind. And so we can't put, you know, wind farms near these reefed rigs. We can't put them near idle iron, can't put them near active derelict platforms, can't put them next to these pipelines. So it really reduces the scale of what we can do for offshore wind. Next slide, please. And so it is not official, like people don't know this exists, but there is an orphan well program on the OCS. If you search inside the Bessie and Boehm budgets, which was submitted to Congress recently. Excuse me, and this is actually from Carbon Tracker's excellent report talking about how, sorry, lockjaw, that the agency is only holding 3.5 billion in decommissioning for up to 64 billion in total liability. And so the orphan liabilities, so this is mostly Fieldwood, but excuse me, there's a total of 55 million. Sorry, I'm gonna mute for a second while I take a cough drop. I tell you, this cold does not go away. So Bessie requested $30 million from Congress. And so they've created an orphan well program that no one knows about. And this is to go exclusively to plug and abandon orphan wells that were mostly associated with Fieldwood. Next slide. I'm so sorry. And so this is a slide deck from a Bessie industry day talking to potential bidders for that program. Like, hey, we got to decommission these properties. And what really stinks is that I've heard that some of these companies bidding are spinoffs from Fieldwood. And so the company that went bankrupt has like these little spin-off companies, and they're going to be the one removing their own properties and getting paid for that. And so just in case y'all don't have any context for this, no, I'll get into it in a second. Sorry, I'll get into this. Just remind me, a trench coat of non-liable entities. I'm going to get back to it. Next slide, please. So I mentioned idle iron. One thing that is really exciting is that if you're in violation of a lease, if you are breaking the law, and you should not be allowed to acquire new leases if you're in violation of an existing lease. But that is not the case. And a colleague who, Freedom of Information, FOIA, she FOIA'd the agency to find out which companies were on the idle iron list that were allowed to participate in the last lease sale, the one that was overturned by the DC court and then reinstated recently. And so there were several companies that have idle iron. So they're in violation of an existing lease, they're in violation of the regulation and law, and they were allowed to acquire new leases. So Chevron, 34 bids, Quarter North, the new spinoff from Fieldwood, 2 bids, Arena Energy, Talos, W&T, and Cox. So yeah, and that's not the only way companies acquire leases. They also acquire leases through transfers. And so, you heard Rob talk earlier about how after a company was already, past solvency, these wells were worth nothing, the milkshake was all drunk up, they were still able to sell to another entity. And so that still happens. And the federal government aids and abets that. It aids and abets fraudulent conveyance. Next slide. I mentioned the decommissioned and placed pipelines. It's a very nice looking pipeline. I should have used a more jacked looking picture. I think I mentioned all this. I described it all. There it is for y'all if you want to take a picture. But I already described this. Next slide. Yes, so offshore winds in the Gulf. So this is a game changer. This is a real big game changer because it finally presents the opportunity for tension and another commercial actor that has an interest. And people in the Gulf have kind of a Stockholm's relationship with oil and gas, even though it is no longer a meaningful source of employment, and it is a dwindling source of contracts for a lot of the maritime industry that it used to support. And the prospect of wind provides an off-ramp and a pretense for cleanup. And I love that poster right there. It's a really good one. So the Gulf of Mexico, of all coastal states, has some of the highest net technical potential for offshore wind. And that is also why it has been as successful for oil and gas, because of that shallow continental shelf. On the coast of California, it goes into deep water really quick. There's a steep drop off very quickly. Louisiana, Texas, it extends fairly far and is shallow water for a long time, which means you can install structures pretty easily and cheaply. And so you look there, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, that's pretty amazing. And people are excited about it. And especially the maritime industry, all your shipbuilders, your fabrication yards, your OSV companies, offshore service providers, all these companies that had once really relied upon oil and gas are now seeing wind as the next move, because oil and gas has become so efficient. We have doubled production in the Gulf of Mexico in the last 10 years, while oil and gas jobs have dropped by 60%. And it's because we can produce more with less people and with less equipment. And so that leaves a lot of vendors and other companies kind of left without an option. So now they're going all in with wind. And so one thing to note right here, so the left picture, that was the call area, and these are where the blue areas where there was company interest. So companies were like very interested in all those areas. And then after the analysis of what conflicts existed, the one on the right is what was determined by the agency as viable. Next slide, please. And one thing I like to point out is that the agency already has the authority to do a lot of what we want to do. They have authority to order decommissioning at any point, like those pipelines. They can, even if they allow a company to decommission a pipeline in place right now, they can go back and order them to remove it for any reason. If it constitutes an obstruction, it's no longer the mission of the agency, whatever. And that's very, it's written in several areas. And, this is from the contract that every lessee signs. You have to remove all of your facility, all of your infrastructure. You have to plug your well. But I want to add an exciting addendum to this. If y'all are not familiar with the IBLA, it's the Interior Board of Land Appeals. It's an administrative court within the Department of the Interior. The agency, so Bessie recently ordered a company to remove their pipeline. The company had requested that they could decommission in place, as was tradition. And the agency said, nope, it's in conflict with borrow areas, the sand resources I was referring to for coastal restoration. The company appealed. It said, well, that's not fair. You had previously allowed us to decommission pipelines. This is arbitrary, capricious, your rulemaking, blah, 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 blah. And the IBLA said, nope, actually, this is their authority. This is their discretion, and they can do it at any point. So this is a big title shift. This happened last week. So I encourage you to go look up that ruling. The IBLA court has not so many appeal documents, but they're worthwhile reading. Next slide, please. And so policy proposals, I'll try to be quick so we can hear the guy you really want to hear from. So years ago, I was part of a delegation of people with the agency who met with the Danish Energy Administration about offshore wind. And we were talking about issues of bonding and how they dealt with the complexity of companies that were not financially really qualified to do the work, but you had to make sure they could. Here's the thing, in the Gulf of Mexico, the requirement the threshold to hold a lease in the Gulf of Mexico in American federal waters is to have an American citizenship or residency and a pulse. That is it. That is it. And the Danish were very European. They're like, oh, well, we only allow those who can do the work to ever bid and to own a lease. And I was like, what a novel idea. You mean we shouldn't allow certain companies that are just a trench coat of non-liable entities to operate on the Gulf of Mexico? Because that was what we were seeing, was that a lot of the big companies were going into deeper waters, or Chevrons or Exxons. And then these other companies were like, who dat oil and gas, but they were really just like a hedge fund from New York coming into the shallow area to buy up those declining assets and planning to just drain it dry and then run. And that's what you saw with Fieldwood. Fieldwood was intentional. This company had no intent on dealing with their liabilities and every intent to push it back the food chain. So yes, tightening fit to bid, tightening who can produce produce oil and gas in the United States. I think that's something we don't talk enough about, is that, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, the Mineral Leasing Act, both of these bills grant a great deal of latitude to the federal government in establishing who can produce oil and gas. And so what we should do is just tighten who can participate, who can actually make money from oil and gas resources. And you already see this with offshore wind. Offshore wind regulations actually have a high ceiling, probably because of that conversation with the Danish Energy Agency. And we should just, create parity between the two programs. If there's going to be a high ceiling on who can produce wind, well, then that should be extended for oil and gas as well. Yep, and then of course, enforce OSLA, the current regulation prohibit bidders with infrastructure on idle iron, and prohibit bids with, delinquent rentals, royalties. One thing I talked to these cats about before was that DOI is aware of bad actors, bad companies that, you can't even reach them. Like they don't respond to phone calls about being late on their royalties or rents. They're not even like the return that we, the American people, are supposed to be getting, we're not even getting. And then they're allowed to still acquire new leases. And then of course, control the transfer. Don't allow a company like Exxon to sell to Fieldwood. Next slide. And this is kind of back to what Rob was saying, lease trust funds and an orphan liability trust fund. So the trust fund is basically real cash on hand. You can either have the full cost of decommissioning or like function like, a mortgage where they're putting a little bit of money every month until it's fully vested. We know how much it's going to cost to decommission because of those decommissioning cost estimates from Bessie. So let's just put it off into a real account. What's better than an IOU? Cash. And so that's what we can force these companies to do. And then the Orphan Liability Trust Fund, either we pay or the industry pays. And so this is just a general fee, levied across the whole industry operating in the Gulf, and say, hey, this is your neighbor sucks fee. It's not us, it's you pay it. Next slide, please. And I saw like a good point that I wrote, because it's like we already have a class of wells that are orphans, that are idled. And that way we deal with those by imposing that fee. And so I think one problem that we have in general is that we do not have energy policy in the United States. We're doing everything by tax credit. Sorry, IRA. And we're not really like being intentional about how we plan this transition. And what I recommended to the agency recently was that a lot of the oil and gas that we're producing right now is intended for foreign markets, right? Like LNG, crude oil export ban that was overturned. It is about, it's international control via our commodities. And, these programs were created not to make companies money or as a means to be a stick for our so-called allies. It was always intended to ensure energy security for American citizens, for the American people. And I think that there should be, straight analysis. Like if we have the choice between giving the lease for offshore wind that will supply, Texas communities, or develop this lease for oil and gas that's just destined for, some country that we're just trying to control, then let's use this for offshore wind. And so that's one policy recommendation. Next slide, please. That's it. Okay. And on to my colleague.
Hi, folks. Thank you. And happy to be at least virtually at PIELC this year. I've been privileged to attend once in person and hope to make it back someday. I am aware of the time, so I'll try to be efficient with these slides, but basically the presentation I'm going to give is sort of an example of the problem that Rob alluded to earlier on of transferring assets during that holdback period, during that period where there's likely not enough cash flow to cover the wells plugging and abandonment by the entity that obtained it. And the company that I'm going to focus on is Diversified. Well, there's a number of related companies that I'm going to call Diversified. The main holder of wells is the Diversified Energy Company. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Diversified Oil and Gas, which is a publicly traded company on the London Stock Exchange. And there are another slew of related subsidiaries that operate in various states. But DEC, or Diversified Energy Company, is the one that operates in West Virginia, where I am based, and is the primary well holder in our region. So the first slide I showed you, I do want to point out West Virginia is a beautiful place. Please come and visit. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to be perpetuating probably a lot of negative stereotypes about the state, but there are some wonderful aspects. So don't forget that. This next slide shows abandoned and orphan wells that are owned by one company, Diversified, in Appalachia. You can see all the blue dots there are abandoned wells. The white dots are all others, but they are largely inactive, non-producing wells at all. And there are about 10 times this many of low producing marginal wells, the majority of which would fall under the stripper category that Rob mentioned before, or the very low producing category. So these are the worst of the worst. And as you can see, there's a slew of them spread throughout Appalachia. These are wells that should be and need to be plugged now, not even getting into the liabilities that are going to come with wells that stop producing in the near future. Next slide, please. This is an example of some of the well equipment that we've seen. One of the first things we had to do in brewing up a lawsuit against Diversified was get clients. And when we met with clients, we wanted to go out and see the state of some of their wells on their lands. This is actually a picture of an active well on one of our clients' lands. As you can see, it's not in great shape. It's old, it's rusty. There was an attempt to, I assume, prevent a leak by wrapping it in a garbage bag and duct tape. That did not work, as a squirrel or raccoon got in there and actually built a nest. Not all wells look exactly like this, obviously, but this is sort of exemplative of what we're seeing out in the field. Even among those wells that are technically not abandoned, technically do not need to be plugged under the law, and are listed as active in the database and are producing gas. Next slide, please. This slide is one of the more incredible things that we found factually so far in assessing wells. Again, we wanted to go out and see what was going on our clients' lands, and one of the things we did to do that is pick a handful for methane's emission testing, see how much methane is actually leaking from these wells. We contracted with Amy Townsend Small at the University of Cincinnati. She is, to my belief and her own, the only person in Appalachia other than industry or regulators that's actually going out and trying to verify what types of emissions are coming from non-producing wells in the region. Amy's been on a lot of public land, national forest lands, parks, things like that, but had not done a lot of monitoring on private land because she simply doesn't have the access and didn't want to trespass. So with the sign up of individuals with wells in their property, we were able to get access. We tested 4 wells for methane leaks, and of those 4, 2 had leaks that were at least an order of magnitude above any previously recorded non-producing well in Appalachia, which to me is just staggering. What it indicates is the problem of methane release is not well understood at all. And when it is accounted for, it's likely being accounted for at much, much lower levels than is actually occurring in practice. And this was a small sample size, just a handful of wells we tested. But the fact that we got numbers, again, an order of magnitude or more above the previously highest recorded non-producing well was pretty astounding. And I will say in West Virginia too, the well owners are not required to report methane emissions as they are in some other states like Pennsylvania. And so these wells would not have been tested before, at least for many, many years. So this is a big environmental problem, even apart from the legacy materials that are left. There's a lot of greenhouse gases that are going in the atmosphere, and it's not something that's well understood or accounted for. Next slide, please. This is an example of a video, and if you just show about 15 seconds of this to keep it short, Kate, if you could go to about the middle. Yeah, this is actually a special, I don't know if it's infrared or what resolution, but this is a camera that was taken out by some volunteers to a county park in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. And again, it just sort of gives you a visual and some idea of the amount of gas that's being leaked from these abandoned wells. Again, this was just one well. It wasn't hard to find. It wasn't like we went searching for the worst of the worst. And this is what's coming from a, quote unquote, abandoned non-producing well in the state of Pennsylvania. We can go to the next slide. This is again a slide of diversified wells that includes inactive wells. It makes pretty much the same point I made before, so we can go ahead to the next slide. Next one, please. All right, so this is where we get into sort of the finances that underlay the legal theories we brought. So diversified is by well count, the largest well owner in Appalachia. They own tens of thousands of wells in multiple states, and dwarf the next biggest well owner, which, as you can see, is EQT, or Equitable, which is actually the most profitable. The problem here is, despite diversified being the owner of the most wells in the region, it is far down the list in terms of the amount of gas that it actually produces. And that's a problem because each of these wells represents a significant amount of liability. As Rob said, industry calculates it at about $30,000 per well to plug. We believe the real numbers, as Rob mentioned, are much, much higher, perhaps 5 to 10 times as much. And when you have a company that's getting this little production, this little income from its gas wells, but has this much liability in terms of well ownership, it's representative of a big problem. Next slide. Yeah, and this is a further breakdown of the wells that Diversified owns, and really furthers the point that these are largely uneconomic wells at that holdback period that are going to become significant liabilities in the near future, and that really represents a greater liability than they do an asset. So this is actually from a report that was put together by the Ohio River Valley Institute that broke down wells based on various regulatory definitions of low producing, and they actually dug up around for a number of different sources, because that 15 BOD barrel of oil equivalent per day really didn't quite represent how bad this portfolio of wells is. And so here you can see, the high producing wells that Diversified owns are just 1% of its portfolio. Even those stripper wells, which are fairly low income, which is the low category that Rob had mentioned, only represent about another 1%. And you see the vast majority are well below even that stripper level of production that should be worrisome for a well asset. You go to the next slide. So what has Diversified done? So Diversified, through a number of methods, has convinced regulators and investors that it can make money off acquiring these old assets that other companies don't want. And since 2014, they have made it their business to go out and purchase as many old conventional wells from as many companies as they can to increase their well portfolio. And so you can see by the graph just how sharply they have increased their well count. And you can see on the right, an indication of the major transactions they've had in about the last 8 years to make that increase happen. Now, they do all sorts of presentations about how they're well plugging their remediation efforts to get wells back online is better than anything else. When we've talked to people in the industry, the experts that we're working with to develop and bring this lawsuit, say there's nothing new here. We know how to plug wells correctly. Everybody's known how to plug wells correctly for quite a long time. There's there's nothing new under the sun, and there is no magic bullet that Diversified has found to reduce these liabilities and bring wells back online. So how has Diversified really justified this? Next slide. What it has done to basically provide some measure of reasonableness to its strategy is reach administrative consent orders with a number of states where it operates. And those states have basically been either complicit or I would view it almost as held hostage by Diversified. Because as Rob mentioned, if these wells aren't plugged by the well owner, the liabilities then go to the bond, which is greatly undervalued. And then in many cases, the state has responsibilities to go back and plug the wells. And if there's not enough bonding there, then they don't have the ability to expend funds to get those wells plugged. So they have every incentive not to force these companies into a dire financial situation where they go under or the responsibility flows to the states. And so we saw the slides earlier of the number of wells in Appalachia that need to be plugged now. This slide provides a breakdown of the wells that Diversified is required to plug a year. And as you can see, it's 20 per year in each state. So we're talking thousands of wells that need to be plugged, and Diversified has reached agreements where it can get away with plugging, a tiny fraction of that, not just in each year, but overall. When you look at the terms of these consent decrees, extending out to as long as 2034, plugging wells at the rate they're allowed to do will never reach a significant fraction of the wells that need to be plugged. Again, even now, not accounting for future declines and future wells going abandoned. Next slide, please. All right, so how are we trying to deal with this? So we have a case that is currently pending. We filed it last July in federal district court in the Northern District of West Virginia, where we represent a number of named plaintiffs as well as a purported class who own property with Diversified wells on them. Approximately 2,000 or so are property owners who have wells that are currently non-producing and are classified as abandoned under the state's definition of abandonment. And then an additional 18,000 or so have wells that are in some state of production but are not yet abandoned. We are focused on two transfers that occurred between EQT and Diversified in 2018 and 2020. During that time, approximately 12,000 wells were transferred between the two companies. Also, Diversified, transferred to EQT approximately $640 million in cash. So why we're focusing on this is Diversified is a company, as indicated by the slides, that we believe is built to fail, that has excess liabilities, while EQT is the most well-funded well owner in Appalachia. They have the money, they could do this plugging. We are through this lawsuit trying to claw money back from EQT to ensure that those wells get plugged, and that two companies, Diversified in the short term and EQT in the long term, aren't allowed to profit from Diversified taking on these legacy liabilities. We've asserted two legal theories. The first is a remedy at common law under tort. Essentially, under West Virginia law, a mineral extractor or mineral operator is only allowed to do what is reasonable and necessary for mineral extraction based on the surface owner surface rights. So they can come on the property, they can drill for oil and gas, they can get it out, but they can't. A lot of the case law is about things like, parking trucks for extracting wells on other people's property, having big holding tanks that are used for multiple properties. They're not allowed to do things that go beyond the extraction of oil and gas on that property. Our tort theory is essentially the maintenance of abandoned well structures is not reasonable and necessary to the extraction of oil and gas. Therefore, because it exceeds the allotted activity of the operator, the allotted property rights that the mineral owner has, it is an unnecessary burden on the surface landowner and indeed a trespass to that property. Next slide, please. The other legal remedy is based on the Uniform Voidable Transaction Act. And the Uniform Voidable Transaction Act is, it's like the UCC. It's a uniform act that was developed by the Uniform Code Commission. Most states have adopted, I believe 38 of the 50 states have adopted the Uniform Voidable Transaction Act, mostly straight from the Uniform Act itself. And the Uniform Act allows you to claw back assets that were transferred inappropriately. It's a creditor's remedy that essentially attempts to take back those assets to satisfy the creditor's claims. So in here, our creditor's claims are going to be the obligation to plug those wells on their property and remove equipment. And we're trying to get back that $640 million that was transferred from Diversified to EQT in the 2018 and 2020 transactions to satisfy those obligations for the creditors, our plaintiffs. And this can be done in one of two ways. A transaction is voidable if you can show specific mental intent to actually hinder, delay, or defraud a creditor, or you can show that a transaction is voidable constructively if two conditions are met: the creditor did not receive a reasonably equivalent value for the transfer, and the creditor was insolvent at the time of the transaction or as the result of the transaction under a number of tests that are laid out in the bankruptcy code. The simplest being an asset balance test, where you literally value the company's assets and its liabilities at the time of the transfer. And if the liabilities are larger, that company is statutorily insolvent and the transaction is voidable. To do this requires a lot of expert work because it does require valuing the full assets and liabilities of the company. But it's a really powerful statute in the context that we see, where these major operators are transferring liabilities onto companies like Diversified that don't have the assets to comply with their obligations. So in conclusion, abandoned and orphan wells are major sources of greenhouse gas. They're major environmental problems. As Rob said, the problem is going to get worse because of lessening gas prices, lower dependence on natural gas. And we expect to see many more transfers like the ones we see with Diversified happen, not just in Appalachia or across the country. State regulators aren't going to be the solution to the problem. They don't want to take on these liabilities. They don't want to spend bond dollars that they don't have to. And they have an incentive to try to keep these companies afloat, keep the problem hidden. And so what can we do? I think it's going to take a lot of creative legal strategies as well as policy advocacy to get at this. The oil and gas industry has done a really good job of insulating itself from a lot of the more traditional environmental laws. And so things like tort law and actions like the Voidable Transactions Acts are going to be, the kind of sources of law that they're likely going to be useful towards addressing this problem. And I know we're about out of time. I believe we've got one or two questions, but thank you very much.
Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, thank you, everybody. So we did kind of run out of time. I know some people have to leave, but if some people want to stay and ask questions, we can definitely do that with our panelists. I've also put everyone's email on the slides if you're interested in discussing anything with folks after the panel. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how well does plugging work? I'm primarily interested in onshore, so is that really the end of the game? I know that all of you kind of touched on that, but are there post-plugging monitoring requirements or things like that?
So I don't know if you heard that. It's how well does plugging work? Are there post-plugging monitoring requirements?
Megan,
know.
you want this question? Yeah.
I do. There is no post plugging monitoring, although I propose it. Yeah, I would assert that it is not plug and done and that there will be a percentage of wells that probably will fail and monitoring should be required. You know, we saw in the Permian Basin in Texas, a landowner who's been very vocal because of some pretty recently plugged wells, Chevron wells from the 90s, which failed and blew out. And it is likely caused from saltwater injection wells nearby had flooded the subterranean area and corroded and caused those wells to blow out. So no, we do not have any post-plugging monitoring. They very much treat it as plug and done and walk away. Although most state law does probably treat it as a forever liability, that the regulations are written as such that it is permanently plugged, that the water aquifers are insulated, that everything is done as it should be. And if that is not the case, then they could theoretically come back to those companies and say, redo it, replug it, reabandon it.
I would just add to that, you know, you have two other drivers. I mean, one is we have a bunch of wells that are listed as plugged today, but there's really been minimal oversight. So you can find, there may have not been plugged even to requirements. And then the second is you still have active drilling. And so what the industry calls frac hits. So you have the pressurizing, it's on the lines of what Megan is saying, pressurizing a reservoir where you had a plug from maybe decades ago, and it could destabilize that. And that's particularly the case when they go in and re-drill acreage.
And I forgot to mention those Chevron wells, when they went back into them, one of those wells had several feet of cardboard instead of cement. So how well are they plugged is the question.
Rob, I wanted to mention, were you aware that the Colorado took action against KP Kaufman earlier this month?
Yeah, well, I had been following it some. I mean, I hadn't seen all the details, and yes, they were in the crosshairs. I probably should have mentioned that. It's just one of these issues that it's maybe long past time, which is not to criticize the action they're taking now. I think that's better late than never, but yeah.
Are there any other questions from the audience? We've lost a lot of our audience. It's lunchtime here, so. All right, well, I think with that, I want to thank our panelists, thank everyone for attending the panel, thank the University of Oregon Law School, and especially the students who put on the presentation and brought us all here together again. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, guys.